In the last lesson, I showed you about the basics of transformations, how to rotate, how to scale. There's lots of options. But in this lesson, we're going to build a little demo. Now, what's also cool about this site, tinkerbin.com, is you have options. So if I want to use Haml to build the HTML, I can do that. For CSS, if I want to use a preprocessor like Sass or less, I can do that as well. And the same thing for CoffeeScript. So if you're not familiar with these, that's okay, but I think you should take a look at them because they're really, really handy. So I'm going to give you a crash course simultaneously as you learn about transformations. First, rather than doing HTML, let's write in Haml. And what this does is ultimately you always end up with HTML. But if we write in Haml, we can create the necessary markup much more quickly. So for example, rather than to create the word hi within a div, I could do div hi, like so. But in Haml, all I have to do is write div hi. And now if I generate it and I view the source, you can see we get the exact same output. So what is this percentage? Well, that's how we designate an element name. So percentage div, and then we give it the value. If I need to add some attributes, I can do it within parentheses. So for example, style equals margin 20 pixels. And now if I reload the source, you can see that adds that on there for me. So you still might be skeptical, but let's consider how we would create an unordered list with a couple list items. Well, first, rather than doing this, notice how long this is taking me. All right, that was around 6-7 seconds. Instead, we can do percentage, and then it uses indentation to figure out where our nested element should be. So now I'll indent, create a list item, and if I reload that, we've created that markup. Hello. And notice how much quicker it is. Finally, if we want to add IDs or classes, we can use the CSS syntax. So if I want li with an ID of my ID, reload, you can see that's now been applied. Same thing for classes, use a period, what you're used to within your CSS files. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get started. I'm going to create a UL and a list item, and I want to create a flipping card. So as I see it in my head, and think with me, we're going to have a little card, and on front of it will be maybe a number. Maybe it'll be a match game where you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and each number is on its own card. Then, when you hover over that number, I want the card to switch over and show something. In our case, we'll just use some random images. And then maybe that could link to somewhere, maybe not. All right, so as I see it, if I'm going to have a card, I need to have a div for the front side of the card and a div for the back side of the card. So let's do that now. Within the li, I will create a div, and the first one will be called front, and the next one will be called back. Now, the back side will contain the image. So I'm going to paste in an image, and we'll say image source equals, and I will paste in a path to some random source image on NetTouch. All right, so let's see the source that generated for us. Isn't that neat? And look how much less code. It's less than half the amount of code that we would need. Now in this case, I accidentally made a mistake. I forgot to add the percentage. So redo that, and there's our image. All right, so now we have a full list item. For the time being, for the front, we'll give it a number, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to hard code that in right now. There we go. So the next step for me is I'm going to repeat this a handful of times so we have a bunch of cards. I'll do the first one with you. I'll copy that, paste it in, and now we have 2. All right, so I'm going to pause so you don't have to watch me and repeat this a handful of times. There we are, and now you can see I've repeated this code many times. Let's see how it looks, and I'm going to run it. And there we are, we have a bunch of the same image and a number. All right, so this looks terrible, but now we can have some fun and get into the CSS. The first thing is to style our list items. So once again, we could do standard CSS, or if you want to learn a little bit about preprocessors, I'll show you how to use Sass, which is a preprocessor that makes things a lot easier and quicker, similar to the way Haml works. I'll show you how. Don't worry, it's pretty easy. We're going to begin by styling our list item. And I'm going to make all of them 200 pixels, give a height of 200 pixels. Just for now, I'm going to give it a background color so we can see what we're working with. And then I'm going to float all of them to the left. And that's where we are currently. Next is I don't want those list items, so I'm going to remove them. List style, none. There we are. And next we need some spacing, definitely. So we'll say margin right is 20 pixels and maybe 50 pixels of margin on the bottom. There we are. The next step is I don't want to see the one and the image. At any given time, I only want to see one side of the card. So that means they both need to take up the same space. So let's do this, li, and then we're going to get the divs, and that's going to target these two divs, front and back. Now, I could do li div like so, and just for the time being, why don't we give it a color of yellow? And there you can see that's yellow. But with Sass, among many other features, we can nest elements. So within the li, I could nest a div and say, make that yellow, and then I can remove all of this. If I run it again, you can see we still have yellow, but if we view the source, and I scroll down to the bottom, you can see that it ultimately creates simple CSS. That's always what's happening. This is just an easier way. It pre-processes your CSS, and this allows you to have access to things like variables and such. Now, we're going to style the back and the front card. So we're going to make the width 100%, and the height 100% of its container. And then, so they're not on top of each other, I'm going to make the position to absolute. And now you can't see it because one is on top of the other. If you'd like to verify this, I could say get that front card and give it a z-index of a higher number. And you can't see it right now because it's black, but if I make the color red, you can see that is showing up. Okay, let's continue on. Next, I know because I'm absolutely positioning my divs that I should have a positioning context for their parent. So just to be safe, I'm going to make sure that I apply a position of relative to the list items. Next, I'm going to continue with this front right here, and we're going to align all of the text to the center, and then I'm going to apply a line height equal to the height of the element so that we can center the number on the page. Next, we're going to give it a font size of 80 pixels or so, and then I will make the color equal to black. There we are. So now we have two images, one on top of the other. And the reason why we're seeing the front instead of the back is because we have applied a higher z-index. If we remove that, based upon the order that this occurs in the document, the second div would have a natural higher z-index. So that's why we're going to make sure that no matter what, it has a higher z-index. Good. So the next step is when I hover over one of these list items, I want to ultimately spin the card around. But for now, we're going to make it work in all browsers. So we'll simply just show the other one. We can return to our list item. And now to do something like hover, we can use this syntax, and : hover. List item, and when it hovers, then we can say background red, hover over it. Just for the example, we'll make the width 400 pixels. So I hover over it, and now the width has increased. Cool. So in our case, though, when you hover over the list item, we want to remove the z-index from the front. That will be one way to do it. So we can say when you hover over it, then get that front div and set the z-index to 0 in this case. So now if I hover over it, it is working. Good. Now I also see because I am hovering over it, I should make sure that I set the cursor to a pointer, and that provides a little more feedback. Hover over it, and now we can see it. Good. All right, so that's the easiest part. The next step is, though, how can we actually simulate the flipping of a card rather than just instant changes? And we're going to use transformations to do that. Let's begin by getting the back div, and remember that's what contains the image, and we're going to rotate it by default. So in its current state, it's going to be transformed, and we're going to rotate it on the y-axis. So I'm going to use rotate y here, and we're going to rotate it 180 degrees. Now, you're not going to see anything take shape, but let me hide the z-index for the time being and switch the rotate to something you can see, such as 110 degrees. Now, can you see how that looks? And this is how, with simple animation, how you can simulate a flip is actually what's happening is the width is going down to 0, and then it expands back to its original width. And that's how you get the illusion of spinning. So, for example, if I do 10 degrees, it's getting smaller. Now, if I switch it to 20, smaller again, 40, 80. And then once I go up to 130, you're going to see that that's the exact same thing as if we had done 50. And if I reload, it's the exact same thing, but only because we're working within 2D space. And we'll learn how to use 3D space shortly. So now I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees, and that's going to essentially reverse it. And if you think in human terms, if you had a card and you wanted to see the other side, it would be reversed because you would have to walk around to see it show up. So this is good. If I return the front, now we have the front side of the card and we know the back side of the card is flipped over. So the next step is when I hover over one of these list items right here, I want to rotate both the front and the back. So we could say right here, when you hover over a list item, get that front div, and we're going to transform it. And notice for the time being, I'm only using the WebKit versions of these properties, but at the end, we'll make it work for all browsers that support it. And we'll rotate it once again, Y. And because we are using a flip, we're gonna rotate that 180 degrees. When you hover over the list item, we take the very top card and we spin it around. And now this is going to be instant because we haven't applied a transition yet, but that's okay. Now we're seeing the wrong side of the tuts image. We want to rotate that as well. So we'll do it right here and hover, then get the back element. And once again, we will rotate it, but this time it's going to rotate back to its resting spot of 0. So if I hover over it, it looks like we're not doing anything new, but as soon as we add transitions, you're going to see this take shape. I'm going to go to the div right here and I'm going to specify transition. And for now, let's just transition everything. And now if I hover over it, all transitions are going to be applied to the divs. And if I hover over it, all right, we're starting to get kind of a cool look. It doesn't look quite right, but we'll work on that. The first thing is I'm going to get rid of this red color. Remove it. And now when I hover over it, we're getting this simulation of a flipped card, the 2D version of a flipped card. So if this is all you did, this is a cool little trick right here. Flipping it around, and then when you get off it, it flips back and it reverses. But it's still very 2D because we're using that trick I told you where the width shrinks to 0 and then it expands back, and that's what gives you the illusion that it's flipping. But what if we could apply a perspective? And we can. So let's do this at the top. We'll get the unordered list, and I'm going to apply a perspective to this element, and we're going to give it 500. And I want you to see what that's going to do. It's going to look a little odd. If I hover over it, now we're getting a little bit different. It's not simply shrinking, it actually has a bit of an angle. Now, the lower the number, the bigger the perspective. So if I set it to 100, watch what happens. Whoa, that's a little freaky, right? And if we set it to 1,000, that's going to be much more subtle, but it still shows a little bit. You get a little bit more angle. So you'll see a lot of developers or designers will stick right around 600. That's a bit of a natural feel. All right, but now we have this interesting thing where we're beginning to see with the perspective that we're not actually dealing with a card, we're dealing with multiple divs. So what we really want to have happen is we want to make it appear that a div is plastered to one side of the card and the back div is plastered to the other side of our fictional card. Now, I'll show you how to do that. We're going to target all of the divs, and now I'm going to say WebKit backface, don't let this scare you, visibility. And I'm going to set that to hidden. That means when you rotate it, the back side of an element you will not be able to see. So again, don't let this scare you, but let's just see how it works. If I hover over it, look at that. That seems to fix our issue. Very cool. So why is that working? Well, let's comment out. And by the way, I'm using this underscore. This isn't an official form of comment, but you know with CSS, regular CSS, we have to do that. So if you apply an underscore, really what that's doing is it's called the IE6 hack. You're only targeting Internet Explorer 6. But I use it as a really quick and easy way to comment out a line temporarily. You never want to have that in your final code unless you actually mean to target Internet Explorer 6. All right, so now if we get rid of the visibility hidden trick and I hover over this, can you see what's happening? When I hover over it, I'm now seeing the opposite side. But if we want to say, no, I don't want to see the back face at all, you can use this property, backface visibility. And then when we hover over it, you can't see it. And that's really what we need in this case. Now, I'm going to keep the z-index on, and this is looking good. So now I can hover over this, but it's a little slow. So if we want to make that faster, I can adjust the transition property and maybe make it 0.5 seconds. And now that'll be much more snappy, like so. Now in the next lesson, we're going to finish this up by taking a look at counters and how those can be used. And then we'll also take a look at some fun ways that we can use box shadows innovatively. So stay tuned.